Irony is the defining technique of romantic literature. That's why I'm having you examine it in your papers to learn how romanticism works, how it communicates with readers. Um, but technique is not the ultimate concern of romanticism. Romanticism's ultimate concern is freedom, human freedom, the new sense of self, and the new sense of the authority of individual experience ushered in by the French Revolution. Explore freedom. Explore the freedom to create new ways of writing and new ways of reading. So we saw in Jane Austen the invention of a new kind of narration, and that's to say also the invention of a new kind of reader. Um, Austen teaches us how to read her. Um, Wordsworth famously said that artists create the taste by which they are enjoyed. So, to enjoy an artist is to learn a new taste, a new way of enjoying. Um, that's the romantic metaphor of growth. We, just like we saw in Jane Austen, those two stages of love. Um, to fall in love is not just to find an appropriate love object, but to learn how to love, to be punished and instructed by experience. And that's true of the experience of reading. We have to struggle to find our footing, our orientation amongst the ironies of a Jane Austen novel. And that's true also of Blake, that he's creating uh, wildly new kinds of writing in order to create new kinds of readers. Um, so, again, what do I mean by what does irony mean? In Jane Austen and in Blake, it means reading language as active. Reading language not just for its propositional content, but reading language as an active expression of a particular perspective. It's to say, language it's always encapsulated in a certain kind of perspectival bubble. We see the language of Austen's characters embedded in Austen's narrative. A certain worldview is always encapsulated in language that people speak, and then the way in which the narrator echoes that language even without quoting it. So, in the famous first line of Pride and Prejudice, we can see the bubble of the worldview of someone like Mrs. Bennet, um, and even more complexly, we can see the ironic mockery of that worldview in the precision of the language, the way in which those first words are a little too subtle, little too clever for Miss Bennet herself actually to say. Probably they sound something more like Elizabeth would say in making fun of her mother. And in fact, that's how the BBC version, that's one of the first lines in the BBC version, we hear Elizabeth mocking her mom by saying those words, mocking her mother's excitement over Bingley's arrival in town. So that's what we're getting instructed in as we read the novel. We might not be able to read these multi-layer perspectives in the first line, the first time we read the first line of Pride and Prejudice, but as we read through the novel, we become attentive to. We're instructed in. We're given an ability to read these social conflicts in the expressions, in the individual expressions of particular characters. So that makes us this ability to read history, historical conflicts in the expressions of the moment. This being able to read at least double, two levels of meaning. It's me expressing myself now, or a particular character expressing themselves now. But through this expression, through my conversation, my relationships, larger historical forces, um, uh, generalizable conflicts, a larger story is playing itself out through my particular experiences and actions. So, the historical conflict that Jane Austen is concerned about is summed up in the title, Pride and Prejudice. The conflict between the pride of traditional aristocracy, nobility, inherited nobility, um, and the prejudice, the judgmental, um, the assertion of judgment and taste, this new consumerist sensibility represented by the middle class, the professional, nouveau riche, that are mingling with the, increasingly mingling with the nobility, with the expansion of capitalism. Um, so that has to do with language. The difference between pride and prejudice is played out in language. The way in which Darcy doesn't need to speak for himself, and the Bennets maybe say too much that it's embarrassing. Um, uh, and so that's a important and helpful way of looking at Blake. Blake is concerned with the historical forces unleashed by the democratic revolutions in the U.S. and France, and is exploring that freedom, that new kind of historical force through language, through his art. He, like Austen, wants to create a new kind of reader. He's creating a new kind of writing, a new kind of art, inventing his own printing methods, inventing a whole new form of publication, distribution of literature and artwork. He's really like a modern hipster in a way. Like it's all about do it yourself. He wants to control the means of production, to make the means of production of his art themselves creative. He doesn't want to passively receive that. That's to say, he's wildly ambitious in terms of his uh, aspiration to create new forms of communication, of mediation. So I think it's helpful to consider a definition of freedom made by the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. He considers, in a book called Four Essays on Liberty, the distinction between positive and negative freedom or liberty. Um, it's really helpful in general because they're concepts that often get it blurred. Um, so it's basically the distinction between freedom to do something positive. I'm free to say something, do something. The purpose of my freedom is to do something in particular, um, versus freedom from, like freedom from censorship or freedom from imprisonment. Liberal society, we tend to emphasize freedom from, and we tend to define freedom in terms of rights. So you have the right to bodily self-determination, to not be censored. That's to say, you have the right to not be interfered with. These are definitions of freedom in terms of being free from encumbrances, limitations on yourself. This is different from the kind of freedom that's usually emphasized by traditionalists like Edmund Burke, who say that freedom from is empty freedom, purposeless freedom. It leaves us without direction. We rely on tradition and culture, positive cultural values, to give our freedom purpose, to tell us what's worth doing. So that's helpful in looking at understanding what's going on in Blake. Blake's ambition was not just to carve out a certain free space, free from encumbrance or censorship or limitation. He wanted to fill that space, demonstrate purpose of individual freedom. So that's to say that now that individuals do not rely on the church or the king to hierarchically transmit downward the what counts as true and good, the purpose of life. Now that individuals are left to their own to define what's true and good. It's what Blake is all about, is emphasizing that's not just like empty free time to like just entertain. The point of freedom is not just to like, do whatever you feel like, to just kind of while away your time. But to express, to creatively assert and express the authority that the monarch and the prophet, the religious prophet, used to express. So he wants to create readers that are fluent and responsive to a kind of prophetic language, so that he wants to create readers that have not just gone beyond the authority of the king and the pope, but have assumed that authority for themselves, and are creatively exploring that for themselves. So his Jerusalem ends by correlating the here and now with biblical time. One of his most famous, the best summation, I think, of Blake's outlook is his proverb from hell. Eternity is in love with the productions of time. Um, uh, the Henry David Thoreau put it another way. You can't kill time without injuring eternity. Um, So that's to say that now that we no longer have to obey the king and the church to or heed what the king and the church tell us are our ultimate destiny, the purpose of our lives, and the hereafter. Um, Now we have to say that for ourselves. We have to articulate that for ourselves. That's to say, eternity is at stake um, in our own, what we do with our time. Our day-to-day experience of time is not just empty um, uh, time to ourselves, um, but is an an occasion to explore what eternity means, what the absolute means, what we used to think about in terms of God. Um, so that's what Blake is exploring here. He's the connection between eternity and the here and now. Did those feet, the feet of the Lord, in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? So, just it's a more intense exploration of Austen's um, juxtaposition of pride and prejudice, the sort of absolute pride and authority of nobility butting up against the new middle class aspirations and judgment and activity. Um, uh, but Blake is just putting this in starker, more radical terms. Um, so, did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills, and was Jerusalem builded here among these satanic mills? So, again, like in the Tiger, he's looking at the factory production, the mills, in biblical terms. Seeing the absolute stakes of religion at stake in the here and now, and therefore assuming that responsibility in the act of writing. And so he finishes here with evoking his instruments of writing, the organ of expression, the means of his production, the tools of his expression, as instruments of divinity. Arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariots of fire. For I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we build Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. This portrait, I can't help thinking of the sword in his hand. He's, obviously talking about his pen or his paintbrush. These are the tools of the eternal that he is claiming to exercise here. And I can't. There's something ironic, I think, here in the way this pen is like it's applied to himself in this portrait. It's as if he's writing himself, And that's if that's fair to say, that's a very apt irony, I think, for his writing. That's exactly what he's saying, and in this passage, it's our responsibility to build the to undertake the mental fight and to actively build to the mental fight is a literary fight, a discursive fight, um, to realize the eternal in the here and now that of the actual contemporary England. Just by juxtaposing the two titles, there's no natural religion. There's no such thing as a natural religion. And on the other hand, all religions are one. No religion is natural, and all of the religions that there are in their artifice are part of the same project. Just these two titles tell us a lot about Blake's project. All religions are produced by human history. They're created, fashioned. They're products of human creativity, imagination. They're not simply given. Blake, I just want to come out and say, is an enemy of empiricism. That's one of his prime targets. He's against the premise that there's a reality out there that we just perceive or can represent passively. All experience is creative. Really key point. And okay, number two, all religions, like all of human history, are part of a common, single, shared human project. And our human creativity is always in conversation. So, our what's at stake in our when we imagine God, the ultimate, the infinite. It's basically a conversation, a project exploring what it means to be human. This is a human invention. We're talking to one another through our various ways in which we imagine the infinite, God. We're participating in common conversation about the common question of what it means to be ourselves. A shared project of being human, discovering human truth. No man can think, write, or speak from his heart, but he must intend truth. It's a philosophical point. The condition that's really integral, really foundational for Romantic philosophy. German idealists like Kant, Immanuel Kant, and Hegel develop this new approach to philosophy. It's based on the sublime, the sublimity of human freedom. It's called critical philosophy and questions what are the conditions of the possibility of speaking and thinking the way we do. So this is what Blake is doing here and saying the fact that we're trying to speak the same language to one another, and we, even if we're disagreeing with one another, but the condition of the possibility, even of disagreement, is that there is some common truth, that there's a standard of truth to which we're both bound, that there's a common concern about which we're disagreement. There's this underlying agreement that's a necessary precondition of even of radical disagreement. Indicates to Blake a shared project, a shared mindedness that all human civilization is participating in. So whatever we do, for whatever reason, we cannot help but think that it's for the sake of truth on some level. So even if I deny I'm invested in the truth, I'm saying it's true that I'm not invested in the truth. Why I say that's responding to this idea of radical or infinite freedom. It's responding to the fact that when we talk, our perception of the world are representing the whole world in terms of an, our own sense of truth, of what is true. There's no higher standard, there's no God that we're taking our dictation from. We're trying to find our own script for what's, we're not inventing it from whole cloth, deciding randomly what's going on. So this singular notion of the truth is humanity's signature prophetic creation or poetic genius in Blake's terms. Less than all cannot satisfy man. So this brings us to Blake's critique, gripe with empirical science. He doesn't like the piecemeal passivity of just defining here's one fact, there's another fact, and recording it as if again we're passively taking dictation from the world. Instead, Blake really insists, this is a basic premise of Romanticism and the philosophical school of idealism that began with Kant. Our perception is active. It seems like we're just taking in sense data through our eyes and ears and so on. But we're, to use Kant's term, synthesizing all these different perceptions, trying to pull them together in a common picture. And so there's something creative about that. This it reminds me in Coleridge, the wind blows through me. I passively experience the wind, but then creatively that am inspired by that. This interaction of what I receive in from the world and what I give back. It's dynamic back and forth. Humanity's pursuit of this ideal, of truth, the whole, means that people perceive more than sense can discover. Big part of Blake's project, and this is important to bear in mind when we get into the sensuous, just gorgeousness of his actual work. That is not just text, but painting, and the interplay of the visual and the textual is so central to Blake. Romanticism and generally Blake, particularly here, it wants to open the doors of perception, in his famous phrase, make us aware of this often subliminal, sublime, subliminal, unconscious creative activity. How do we learn about our unconscious, subliminal, creative activity? Well, Blake's word for it is experiment. Experiment is the means by which humanity learns, pursues its desire, exercises its poetic genius. That's interesting because experiment, that's how science works too. So this is a way in which Blake, and I think Romanticism generally, is true to a principle of scientific method in a way that the dogmatism and complacency and maybe arrogance of a technological culture that since the industrial revolution has sort of taken over the world, dominated the world, and is drunk with its own power. It's easy to forget that science it proceeds by experiment, by self-doubt, falsification, perpetual openness to falsification. That's a famous definition of science by philosopher Karl Popper. The scientific proposition must be falsifiable. So this perpetual experimental openness to falsification is actually a key inheritance of enlightenment that Romanticism ends up deploying to criticize and question the complacency of technological society. A great developmental psychologist I'd encourage you to look up, Alison Gopnik at University of California, Berkeley. She has a lot to say that's really valuable and to the study of romanticism, and corroborates a lot of the intuitions that romantic artists had, both about this point that we learn through experiment and how that is forgotten in the kind of dogmatism of a lot of modern culture and also even education. Gopnik studies childhood development, and one of her basic arguments has to do with what it's known as confirmation bias. Once you know something, you tend to have a bias towards just perceiving things that confirm what you know. But Alison Gopnik is just, through studying the child development, shows that that's not the way children learn. That's only adults. Once we sort of get trained in the sort of mechanical knowledge that we, industrial technology exploits to maximal advantage. And this has a lot to do with, tool use, extraction of the different kinds of manipulation and of the resources of the earth, all depend on repetition, understandable, repeatable patterns. But that's not how children learn. That's not what children value or are interested in. Children tend to be more interested in what falsifies what they know. They're curious about what they don't understand. So rather than exploit what we already know in the manner of adults, children tend to learn through experiment and a curiosity about things that we don't understand. This openness to surprise and accident and change, this is what reveals to us our underlying creativity, the underlying dynamic interplay involved in experience, which is covered up by forms of knowledge that we like to exploit for profit and dominating the environment. We do so by kind of deadening our experience, by making our experience itself also mechanistic. Wordsworth's famous line, "We murder to dissect." So in order to dissect the world, animals, or any piece of the world, disaggregate things into abstract, linear, causal relationships, we have to kill it, extract things from the dynamic, animated interplay of the environment, that Coleridge's wind that blows through and animates everything, and turn it into causal model that's dead insofar as it's mechanically repeatable. Hence Blake's investment in experiment, or seeing experience as a perpetual experiment, openness to surprise, newness, so opening the doors of perception, revealing what he calls the infinity in a grain of sand, infinity of every little accident. Blake's application of this argument. He who sees the infinite in all things sees God. He who sees ratio, that is fact, his term for fact and reason only, sees himself only. It's sort of a dull mechanical repetition of form of mind that just sees fact and reason repeated over and over again. This is that deadening, murdering to dissect, something that like plays out in the poem "The Fly." Now that can sound very outlandish and all coming after Jane Austen, But, it's not actually so far afield. If you think about the importance of experiment and surprise in Jane Austen's plots, the unlikely romance of Lizzie and Darcy, the romance of these unlikely surprises, that's really, I think, a deep lesson of the form of her plots is to distinguish between the shallow romanticism, the shallow appeal of Wickham. Austen distinguishes Wickham's commodified romanticism, his uniform romanticism, from the deeper disruptions, that the deeper strangeness and fear and trauma, of the experience of Lydia, and the unlikeliness of her story, mediated as it is by Lydia and Lady Catherine, and these highly unromantic accidents. That's how the progress from the first to second love works in Austen. Is first love for Wickham is seamless and kind of falls into a prescribed and predictable pattern. The second love is disrupts that pattern, comes in an unpredictable way, and is as much a product of accident, of the environmental circumstances. In a nutshell, this informs Blake's interest in children, the innocence of children, the playfulness of children, the wisdom of children. Is likewise his interest in Satanism, what he calls the infernal method, finding a revelation in unlikely ways. So let's just start out. So this is an early text of Blake's, The Book of Thel. And it has to do with female protagonist. It has to do with sexual awakening. In a way, it's the basic parameters of the plot share a lot with Austen. It begins with this motto: does the eagle know what is in the pit, or wilt thou go ask the mole? Can wisdom be put in a silver rod, or love in a golden bowl? It's about knowledge, it's about definition, about containment, representing wisdom, representing love. It recalls the beginning of the Aeolian harp, where Coleridge is kind of hoping to find meet emblems for apt containers or representations for these ideal values like wisdom and love. Blake here is kind of correlating that with predation, the eagle and the mole. The mole is the prey of the eagle, and with knowledge, we prey on the eagle or the mole in our knowledge, our knowledge about the eagle and the mole. So, how do we answer these questions? What do you think? How do we answer these questions? What do you think? The first seems to suggest the principle of environmentalism is emphasized and affirmed. So you think, oh, the eagle, he's the apex predator, he knows about he dominates everything. But actually maybe the mole knows more when it comes to the pit. So again, it's like what we thought was marginal, it doesn't matter, like the low, but who knows the meager and the low best? What seems like the least significant has its own perspective, its own center of concern. But just as he juxtaposes the eagle and the mole, and he juxtaposes wisdom and love, the silver rod and the golden bowl, there's obviously a kind of gender, sexual dichotomy, symbolism in these images. And what I want to suggest is that these dichotomies are pushing us outward, infinite environmental complexity. We try to contain things conceptually in our knowledge in a kind of predatory way, but they always slip beyond us, like the mole's knowledge of the pit, evoke more complex, more nuanced patterns of interaction. What is, gender difference other than the interaction? Once you start thinking about it in that way, it really brings his imagery to life. His images always are evocative of infinity, of these recursive patterns in nature. Even the letters we see kind of dissolving into these natural patterns, just as he's suggesting knowledge does in Thel's motto. Part of what Blake is intuiting here, fractals are related to what I was saying before about how we organize our sense perception according to the parameters of our own mind. We're always creatively arranging what we see. That's what fractals are about. Fractals mean like fraction of a dimension. Like we have a two-dimensional picture of reality, but once we try to fill it in with as much detail as we can, it's eventually going to start pushing out into a third dimension. And that is true of any representation of reality. So you can see this going on here just in this image. If you look at it, it's like the closer we get to try to get more and more precise. Fractal is a never-ending pattern. Fractals are infinitely complex patterns that are self-similar across different scales. Our attempt to hold the world objectively fixed always dissolves the closer we get in try to get more and more precise. The object folds out into ever higher scales of complexity and detail. Again, I just wanted to remind you how, as distant as that might seem from Jane Austen, the role of accidents, the accidental overhearing, eavesdropping, accidents of whether Lydia was found in this or that London coach. There are really crucial irony in Austen's romance, acknowledging this newly complex modern world and sort of the randomness of social life, but also the organizing power of her art, her novel itself. Her ability to acknowledge but then also artistically contain this complexity in the form of her plots, in the form of the self-consciousness of a character like Lizzie, is likewise correlated with this organic metaphor, the gardeners. She almost makes it into a joke, it's almost like the gardeners, like they planted the romance. They gardened the plot of this novel. It's almost like she ends it with a little joke. Even at the same time, like what's been cultivated is a very deep, intense awareness of the vulnerability, the jeopardy, as well as the intensity of passion and Lizzie's and Darcy's unlikely love story. Fractals are also, now turning back to Blake, the good thing to keep in mind when we look at Thel. The plot, like the fractal, delves into a deeper dimension. The progression that Thel goes through this journey from the cloud to the flower to the worm to the clod and then underground, it's like delving in deeper, and ultimately, like delving into these fractals, ultimately at the deepest level, when looking down underground into her own grave, is a reflection of her own mind. Her senses are reflected back to her, and the self-consciousness of her senses, the way in which the nostril curves a bit against itself, the ear, the sexual organs, this self-disruptive, self-reflective, creative activity underlying perception, the basic theme of Thel. The character of Thel, She might be compared to Lizzie. She has this intelligence, resists complacency. All the characters she encounters, the cloud, flower, worm, clod, um, they're all telling her, "Don't question." They're trying to resolve the doubt in her mind. Thel is she's a female version of Hamlet. She's doubting, raising questions. So she represents a kind of persistence of doubt, of questioning, until the very end, where she's sort of facing the ultimate question of her own death. And then she flees back to this nursery, the sunny flocks. Just want to point out the object of her questioning. O life of this our spring, why fades the lotus of the water? So it's about time, ephemerality. Why do things come and go? She's asking about mortality. Why fade these children of the spring, born but to smile and fall? Ah, Thel is like a watery bow, rainbow, an image of impermanence, and like fractals, an image of active perception. A rainbow isn't a stable object, each person sees their own rainbow. It's an object that's also a reflection of your act of seeing it. It's a reflection of your perspective. So she's expressing this awareness of elusiveness of the outside world, of her own self, like a parting cloud, like a reflection in a glass, like shadows in the water. These are her very key lines here. Like dreams of infants, like a smile on an infant's face, like the dove's voice, like transient day, like music in the air. Do you notice anything about these formulations? A smile upon an infant's face, a dove's voice. These are ambiguous images, like an infant's face, the way it contorts involuntarily. Is that a smile I saw? Or, baby's first smile, baby's first words? Are they really there, or am I just imagining them? The word infant literally means without speech. Pre-linguistic. What does it mean to attribute a smile to a creature that doesn't even know what a smile is? What does it mean to call the music of the dove a voice? How our perception is also a projection of human anthropocentric meanings. To hear music in the atmosphere, we're always giving meaning to the world around us. So if Thel, like Hamlet, is a kind of hero of critical thinking, she can't stop doubting and questioning. That might make you think of Descartes, who is famous for the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," correlating being with thinking. But Blake is also very critical of Descartes in a revealing way in this kind of satire of Descartes, his poem, The Fly. This is a great poem to start with, I think, intro to Blake, because it's so multidimensional and clever. It's about an accident. It's about the experience we've all had of inadvertently or thoughtlessly, as Blake said, slapping and killing a fly. What's at stake in that? Again, seemingly marginal, totally insignificant event. He's focusing attention on. Little fly, thy summer's play my thoughtless hand is brushed away. Am not I a fly like thee, or art not thou a man like me? For I dance and drink and sing till some blind hand shall brush my wing. If thought is life and strength and breath, and want of thought is death, then am I a happy fly if I live or if I die. So the poem begins with this sensuous, sort of accidental, event, and it ends by saying, "I'm happy whether dead or alive. It doesn't matter." He's talked himself out of caring about life altogether. So instead of an assertion of thought, like Thel is paying attention to details of the world, the dove's voice, the infant smile. Her questioning is responding to noticing accidents, and the questions are responding to these details of exploratory experience. Blake's exploration of the Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, thought is life, want of thought is death. Cartesian thinking makes actual sensuous experience irrelevant. Even my own hand, my thoughtless hand, has become alien to me. If I am my thought, my thoughtless hand, he's turned myself, my actual embodied self, into a kind of zombie. Remarkable for this little child's poem. It turns actually quite horrific. Although at the same time it's quite funny. I mean, there's a jokey aspect to it, especially when you reflect on the painting and the other meaning of the title, the fly. Thy summer's play correlates with badminton. So the life and death drama is hidden in this children's lyric and the depiction of human play, human sport. Key human values are at stake everywhere, infinity in a grain of sand. Like the fly, the poems The Tiger and The Little Black Boy also explore ideology. The tiger, the question of the creator, it becomes terrifying in a context of industrialism where creative power is correlated with this violent coercive power of factory production, as in Dickens. Imagery of industrial production, the furnace, the anvil, the chain, the hammer, machinery is dehumanizing. Likewise, Little Black Boy is about how the ideology of race is internalized. A poem spoken from the perspective of the little black boy. He can't escape racist thinking. Correlation of whiteness with purity and goodness. And so at the end of the poem, he thinks he's talked himself out of the denigration associated with blackness. Nonetheless, he's still left waiting to be loved by God and the white boy. So even his dream of transcending race is articulated in implicitly racist terms. This is heartbreakingly believable. The spectacle of a child's mind understanding race and trying to think itself out of race at the same time, and thereby retrapping itself in racist ideology. The tiger, like the fly, has a kind of funny aspect to it too. The interplay with the imagery, because the symmetry that's described in the poem, as so haunting and terrifying, it isn't even depicted in the painting. The painting gives us the tiger in profile. The painting, like sort of like in The Fly, shows the poem as a distortion of reality. The human abstract in London likewise interrogate modern ideologies of compassion. Pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor. If we So we valorize pity, compassion, and charity. That's these are key bourgeois values to care about the poor. But Blake again turns the tables and suggests, well, don't and then in a sense we need poor people in order to be the kind of charitable, compassionate people that we say it's important to be. So in a way, we need to keep creating poor people in order that we can feel sorry for them. We couldn't be these virtuous, compassionate people if we didn't have poor people to feel sorry for. So these are sort of the examples of ideologically critical poems, ways in which he's exposing mind-forged manacles, like this net growing out of the man's head in the human abstract. The way in which we abstract the world, make ourselves abstract by making the world conform to the traps of our own minds. A couple other poems, The Sick Rose and The Clod and the Pebble, work in a little bit different way, more positively, I think, opening the doors of perception by building on nature, natural perceptions, the complexity of nature, rather than simply showing the destructive, imprisoning effects of mental categories or ideologies. The Sick Rose is one of my favorite poems. In vague or not so vaguely sexual ways, interrogating this image of love, this very conventional symbol of love, and questioning whether it disguises sickness. But then at the same time, asking, could what we perceive as disease not have a love, joy, a beauty of its own dark secret love? What's this sort of like racism? What constitutes health and what constitutes disease? How do we draw that distinction actually? Was one wholesomely rosy and the other not? So he's again opening the doors of perception and making us recognize a more complex, more interactive web, ecological reality. The Clod and the Pebble juxtaposes an ideology of Christian charity, love, compassion. He's questioning that like he did in the human abstract. And the opposite, sort of selfish, or like wholesomeness and disease. But he correlates these two attitudes with natural sounds that he hears in the environment, Christian selfless love, and then the selfish attitude he hears in the warbling brook. So sung a little clod of clay trodden with a cattle's feet, but a pebble of the brook warbled out these meters meet. So he's making us think about these sounds. What is a clod of clay? What's that sound? Trodden by cattle's feet. It's a sound of sacrifice. So it's dissolved, self-dissolution. Is that a song? It not like the pebble of the brook makes a proper song. It warbles out these meters meet. You see, so the selfishness is correlated with the hardness of the pebble, and the selflessness, the self-sacrificing attitude is correlated with the self-dissolution of the clod of clay. But these images are complex and don't they undermine the interpretation that the ideology would limit them to. So for instance, the pebble, although it's an image of hard, self-contained selfishness, um, it makes the environment around it sing. So it even if we interpret the sound in terms of this ideology of selfishness, as sinful self-absorption, um, it isn't actually true because it's resonating in the world around it. It's not. The sound is not, in fact, as selfish as the interpretation implies. Um, here, what I want to suggest that, what I was already suggesting about the paintings is how Blake is showing how sensuous experience has a complexity and detail that exceeds the limits of the mind forged manacles of our ideological interpretations. What we hear has a complexity to it that has a lot to teach us.